there is an intense operation led by the United Kingdom where pro-Palestinian influencers are being accused of being manipulated by Russia and China. You have been named specifically in this operation, but these are senior government figures. This is intelligence. It is, by all accounts, an operation. So I'm just going to read a little bit here. It says Russia and China are manipulating public opinion in Britain by promoting online pro-Palestinian influencers to stoke division, White House sources believe. Senior government figures fear rogue states, Russia and China, are promoting polarizing online narratives about the Israel-Hamas conflict. So it's clear, says one of the government sources, foreign states are engaged in trying to manipulate public opinion by skewing the way we interact online. They hope to destabilize and undermine our institutions. So we're going to go down now where they target you specifically, because I definitely want to hear your take on this. But here they talk about rapper Lowkey was found to have 11% fake profiles on X. They talk about your followers. They talk about your posts on October 7th the arrogance to believe you can trap 2 million people in an open air prison indefinitely, that Israel is not a country and has been deliberately starving Gazans. So Lowkey, talk about this operation, because you've been on this show before to kind of blow the lid off of the UK's role in this Gaza genocide and in Israel's genocidal war in Gaza and the region at large. But this is a direct attack by government figures, ostensibly intelligence and military figures. That's usually what I assume when there is kind of anonymous sources happening. So talk about this operation, what's going on, and why are you the target of it? You're muted. Sorry, Lowkey.
Sorry about that. My bad, Danny.
Okay.
All of this is part of a wider push to try and obfuscate the massive industrial scale killing which is happening in Gaza and the popular reaction to it, which is accumulatively over the period of these 7 to 8 months, millions of people in the street. It's tens, if not over 100 direct action operations against Israeli arms sites or companies that deal with Israeli arms in this country. It is a pushback against young people in university who are setting up encampments. And it's a way for them to try and explain away what has happened. But it's also part of a wider crack which is developing in the relations between Israel and China and Russia. So really, to start with, it's important that people are aware that when the Iranians launched the Operation Al-Wa'd al-Sadiq, as it was known, which was the unprecedented move of striking Israel with ballistic missiles and striking Israel with drones, this took place with missile guiding systems that were using Beidou, which is a Chinese company, and GLONASS, which is a Russian company, meaning that the satellite systems that were being used for this unprecedented strike on Israel were both China and Russia. Now, these are major global powers, and Israel is extremely unhappy about that. When we also look at the Russian role in Israel's perception in October 7th, you have the information coming out from Palestinian resistance factions that actually they were granted the licenses to produce Kalashnikov bullets locally in Gaza by the Russian government. Now, from the Russian perspective, it's likely that that would be a response to Israel siphoning small Tavor rifles to the Azov battalion in Ukraine. Obviously, that preceded the granting of licenses by Russia to the Palestinian resistance factions. What also took place was the figures from Hamas talking about the Russians saying to them that they wanted to teach the Tawfan al-Aqsa operation in Russian military schools not long after it had happened. And then you saw the response from that was Israel in November of last year start to apply some of the sanctions that the United States has been encouraging the rest of the world to apply on Russia. And so you see a real crack in the relationship between Russia and Israel. But then you have the Chinese aspect of this. Now, of course, China has the comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran and the projected investment of over $400 billion in Iran over the next 2 decades. What you also have is, according to the Israelis, China operating an informal sanction regime on Israel by no longer exporting to Israel the dual use civil military exports. So Israel have been looking at it and saying, why are we not receiving these exports from China that we usually would that could also be used for military equipment? What we also know is that when Israel cancelled the working permits of all Palestinians working inside it, just so you get a conception of what we're talking about, 60,000 construction workers within the entity of Israel were Palestinian construction workers. They had their permits to work there cancelled straight away after October 7th. So then Israel looked to China to try and fill the gap in the construction industry. But what did they find? Not only did China not allow workers to go and work in Israel during this period, but pre-October 7th, there were 30,000 Chinese workers within Israel. Post-October 7th, at least 20,000 of them have left and not come back. In addition to that, you also have seen China not condemn the Palestinian resistance factions for carrying out the October 7th attack. And then that in some way has led to a situation where you have the relationship between Israel and China has become more strained, with particularly a lot revolving around the Israeli port of Haifa, which China had invested so much in building up. Now, Israel has decided to allow 70% of the control to fall to an Indian billionaire rather than the Chinese companies that were working there. And of course, that is a real issue. We also know that China has condemned Israeli settlement building, and it sought to bar its citizens from involvement in doing that. So what you're seeing developing, especially when you look at the relationship with Iran and the way that that led to even the resistance in Yemen being able to assert itself in the way it has, that is thanks to China and Iran working out a way for Iran and Saudi Arabia to mend bridges. And that's an amazing, when you think about the extent of human loss and human suffering that the war in Yemen, the Saudi, British, US, and Gulf War on Yemen incurred, you have a massive service to humanity being served. But more importantly than that, you have resistance factions in the region being able to have the space to operate and resist Israel. So on that side, you have Israel militating alongside with the war lobby in the United States against TikTok, and it being wrapped up in a lot of the war propaganda against China. You also have to remember in TikTok, in the case of TikTok, all of the data which TikTok gathers in the United States goes directly to a US company by the name of Oracle. Now, this company, Oracle, is headed and founded by Larry Ellison, one of the richest men in the world. Now, Larry Ellison is also the largest donor to the Friends of the IDF in the history of that company's existence. He also loaned Elon Musk $1 billion with which to buy Twitter. Larry Ellison is so close to the Israelis that he actually offered Benjamin Netanyahu the directorship of this company, Oracle, which seizes all of the data that TikTok, accumulates in the United States. So actually, this idea that China is somehow manipulating public opinion to support Palestinians is just simply not true. That China is somehow using TikTok for purposes of espionage is not true. You have so many of the US key classified databases that the military relies on that goes straight to Oracle. If anything, the United States should be asking the question, and politicians there should be asking, is our data safe with a company where the head of it has not only funded the Israeli military, but also offered the position of director to Benjamin Netanyahu. But on top of that, Safra Katz, who's the current CEO of Oracle, went on record as saying that our company are committed to Israel. These are her exact words. And if our employees have a problem with it, they can find another company to work for. And you have even seen employees of Oracle resign because of the closeness of Larry Ellison to Israel. So here then we get to this point about the Daily Telegraph and their frankly bizarre, outlandish conspiracy theory that actually Russia and China are working to boost my account and others like mine in order to manipulate public opinion towards pro-Palestinian conclusions. Now, the Daily Telegraph historically is one of the closest newspapers, right-wing newspapers, to the British intelligence agencies, even so far as the first Director General of the MI5, that's Britain's internal intelligence agency, Vernon Kell, was actually a Daily Telegraph reporter based in in Southeast Asia, interestingly. Now, when we look even further at this picture, we also know that the Daily Telegraph, I would say, is probably the closest also to the Israeli intelligence agencies when you consider that when Israel wanted to send a message to Britain and say that they would drop their cooperation on an intelligence level with Britain if Jeremy Corbyn was elected, where was the newspaper that scoop was given to? It was given to the Daily Telegraph. Now, in this case of this alleged story about myself and others, the article's claim is that 11% of the accounts that interact with mine are actually fake accounts. Now, numerous studies have found that the average fake follow count on Twitter is around 40%. So that's for large accounts, around 42% of their followers are deemed to be fake. Now, that actually shows that in my case, that 11% is not for people that are following me. That is for people that actually engage with my account. So it's far below average. But the important thing here is that the company that was able to deduce this information supposedly goes by the name of Sayabra. Now, Sayabra, which the Daily Telegraph did not state in the article, is an Israeli social threat intelligence company. Now, this company is so close to the Israeli military that 3 of the founders of Sayabra are veterans of the Israeli occupation forces cyber units. At least 40 of the firm's employees are reserves in the Israeli military who were called up to fight in Gaza. Sayabra is in fact so close to the Israeli occupation forces that the CEO, Dan Brahmi, a former combat instructor for the Israeli military, gave a talk recently with the office of the Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson's unit titled On Alert with the IDF. So what you have here is the anatomy of spreading false information in order to give people a perception which is very far from reality. It is about projecting all of the energy that people have. You know, people are naturally against seeing videos of human beings being murdered in the most horrific ways. It's not me, and it's not anyone else, and it's not fake Twitter accounts that are creating that perception. Actually, it's Israeli soldiers who have been incentivized to upload videos on TikTok. You have units within the Israeli military that are based on encouraging the Israeli military personnel to post online, particularly on TikTok, to try and humanize and beautify the image of this genocidal machine, which is bearing down on the people of Gaza. So yeah, we are a small piece of a much wider picture but it's significant to say the least.
Yeah. Yeah. Loki, could you talk about in the piece you mentioned Civitas, you mentioned, Robert Clark was the senior fellow that commented on this. You mentioned that firm. There's also this larger Defending Democracy task force. Could you talk about that? It seems like a consortium of intelligence, political, military officials, and they're it says, dedicated to protecting democratic integrity in the UK from threats of interference by nations such as Russia and China. I just find it so interesting that um, we saw this with the proxy war in Ukraine, with NATO's proxy war in Ukraine, this kind of thing happening. Now, Russia and China are being dragged into the narrative about Gaza and how Israel's losing the narrative. So could you talk about this Defending Democracy task force? Like what is that? Who's in it? If you know anything about it?
So, Defending Democracy Task Force is this grouping which is headed by Tom Tugendhat, who himself is somebody that has very close relationship with the Israel lobby, and of course he oversees MI5. Now, Tom Tugendhat has pushed through this national security bill, which has different ways within it to squash the freedom of media to operate in a critical way around what the British security services are doing, and it limits people's ability to publish information about that. Now, it's my belief that the Defending Democracy Task Force will have some connection to the Integrity Initiative, or at least those who were involved in the Integrity Initiative. Now, I'm not sure if you remember, this was a grouping that came out of the Institute for Statecraft, which was a think tank based around pushing for individuals and politicians within Europe who could adopt anti-Russian positions. And so you saw exertions of power from the Integrity Initiative, which at that time it was a grouping of Western journalists who would coordinate the type of information they would talk about in order to put pressure on governments. And so in one case, you had the head of intelligence in Spain was about to be selected, and there was an individual that it was deemed by these essentially British spooks would be somebody that would not be trustworthy to toe the line on Russia. And so they, through a cluster, were able to produce talking points that would be repeated by many of them to push against the selection of this individual as the head of Spanish intelligence. And they were successful actually in that smear campaign. And so my reading of this Defending Democracy Task Force is that it is an extension of that, and it's a way for the kind of silent war to play out and for the war of information to be extended. And I think, of course, this report, which, you can barely call it a report, there's an anonymous source stating that they think China and Russia are doing something. There's then an Israeli intelligence company that claims that it has found this about mine and several other accounts. And then it's used, there's no causal connection between what a Whitehall source is claiming is happening and then what they're claiming happens with my account. And so the reader is then led to draw the conclusion that there's a relationship between those two things. But no doubt this will go into a larger body of work that will be used to justify this kind of mysterious institutions operations. And of course, they'll push for different forms of legislation to try and really assert full spectrum dominance in the informational sphere.
Well, I think what's happening in Gaza, what Israel has been doing to Gaza with US, UK, and Western help has, I think, raised a lot of concerns by many more people, maybe than ever before, about Israel's influence over governments like the UK's. I mean, even here, I always pay attention to not just what is inside of a report, but also how a report is constructed. And at the very end, you have Israel's Minister of Diaspora Affairs, Amici Chikli, say that British authorities, quote, need to be far more active, far more aggressive against these enemies, which threaten not just the Jewish community, but the way of life and basic values of Britain as a democratic state. With another government spokesperson in the UK saying, defending our democratic processes is an absolute priority, and we will continue calling out malicious activity that poses a threat to our institutions and values. I mean, it almost ends with an Israeli demand and an affirmation that the UK will follow an Israeli. I mean, your reaction to what could occur now from this kind of mandate that this consortium of military intelligence operatives are kind of pushing forward?
Well, I think ultimately, on the personal level, there will be some form of lobbying happening, whereby social media companies are being sent certain reports that could lead them to agree with these individuals, and maybe would push down an account like mine, just so we can get a further idea of how threatened the British government is, unfortunately, by things that I am writing on Twitter. You had recently a Muslim network within the civil service actually suspended from operations because they had been working on ways to help Gaza, but also, and this is cited in the Times article, they had exchanged anecdotes about a lecture I had given. So that was seen as one of the reasons that the Muslim network within the British civil service was suspended. In addition to that, you also have this Wolney report, and I think it's important we do touch on that. You know, Jonathan Woodcock was somebody who was a member of the Labour Party. He was the head of the Labour Friends of Israel, and he was in a situation where he was accused of sexual harassment by an aide while he was in the Labour Party. Now, rather than wait out the investigation into his conduct to be carried out by the Labour Party, he used it as an opportunity to bash Jeremy Corbyn and left, claiming that the investigation was biased against him. So therefore, he escaped any type of scrutiny about the alleged sexual harassment that he carried out, according to this woman who worked for him. And then Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, selected him to enter the House of Lords. Now, the House of Lords is a permanent for life seat where people are able to work on the legislation of the British state. Now, Woodcock then became Lord Wolney. Now, once he became Lord Wolney, he was tasked several years ago by the British government with preparing a report of over 100,000 words as the independent, quote unquote, independent advisor to the government on political disruption and extremism. And so now he has produced this report, and you have to remember that he not only was the head of the Labour Friends of Israel, he's also accepted funding from Israel lobby groups even as recently as January. He also traveled to Palestine on a trip funded by the Israeli government, where he planted trees with Israel's largest settlement building organization, the JNF. But also importantly, he is the chair of something called the Defense Purpose Coalition, which is a lobbying group that is paid by an arms company called Leonardo to lobby on its behalf. Now, he prepared this report looking at so-called extremist groups within this country. He mentioned in his report Palestine Action 103 times. He mentioned me 3 times. He alleged in his report that my music on occasion is a form of apologism for terrorism. He claimed that my song Long Live Palestine demonstrates anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And he's also calling for the banning of Palestine action. He's listed 40 recommendations, some of which are just truly astounding in their suggestions, and also dystopian in terms of what they would mean for democratic life in this country. So all of this is part of a wider push towards a more fascistic society, a narrowing of the political potential within the society, and the silencing of voices like mine who are critical of what the unaccountable parts of the state do.
Yeah, definitely. And I remember when I was in Vietnam at the time, where October 7th, post October 7th, I think it was like October 11th, 12th, 13th, and it was, Israel was full steam ahead in its horrific bombing campaign, in its genocide. And I remember Palestine Action on X. I would try to follow Palestine Action, and every time I would try to follow, I would be unfollowed. I'd be unfollowed. And of course, I think Palestine Action was trending at that time because Twitter X was literally preventing people from following it. So yeah, this goes really deep, and we definitely, I mean, that's why it's so important that we all elevate each other and ensure that we all have platforms where we can go, because the censorship is going to get more intense. And Lowkey, you've been dealing with this for many years.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.